The thermometer read -18 degrees Fahrenheit when the power grid failed for the third time that week, and I knew civilization was about to collapse around my frozen fortress. I managed the Glacier Point cold storage facility, a sprawling industrial complex that stretched across 2 city blocks in the heart of Nebraska's distribution corridor. 100,000 square feet of temperature-controlled space, stacked floor to ceiling with enough frozen meat, produce, and packaged goods to sustain a small city for half a year. The morning the outbreak reached Lincoln, I was doing inventory in Warehouse C when my assistant manager Marcus called from the loading docks, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "Derek, you need to see the highway right now." I left my clipboard on a pallet of frozen chicken breasts and walked through the plastic strip curtains that separated the freezer sections from the loading area. Marcus stood at the roll-up door, his silhouette framed against the gray October morning. When I reached him, I understood why his voice had cracked. Interstate 80 looked like a parking lot designed by someone who'd lost their mind. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles, doors hanging open, possessions scattered across asphalt that stretched to the horizon. A semi-truck had jackknifed across 3 lanes, its trailer split open, spilling cardboard boxes that tumbled into the median. Smoke rose from at least a dozen fires visible from our position. But what made my stomach clench was the movement between the vehicles. The shuffling figures that moved with a gait that wasn't quite human anymore. "That's what they've been talking about on the radio," Marcus said, his hand gripping the doorframe. "The infection. It hit Omaha yesterday, Grand Island this morning. Lincoln's gone, Derek. The whole city's gone." I watched a figure stumble through the debris, its movements jerky and purposeless, before it suddenly locked onto something and sprinted with horrifying speed toward a car where someone was trying to start the engine. The distance was too great to hear the screams, but I saw the vehicle rock violently before the infected thing smashed through the driver's window. Marcus turned away, but I kept watching. I needed to understand what we were facing. This wasn't some theoretical disaster anymore. This was the end of the supply chain. The end of the assumption that tomorrow would function like today. "How much food do we have on site?" I asked, my mind already shifting into logistics mode. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through our inventory management system. "Full capacity. We got that massive shipment from the beef processors in Kansas on Monday. The produce trucks from California came Tuesday. We're at 97% capacity across all temperature zones. Maybe 400 tons of food, give or take. 400 tons. Enough to feed thousands of people for months if rationed correctly. Or enough to paint a target on our facility that every desperate survivor within 100 miles would eventually find." I looked at our perimeter, a chain-link fence that a determined child could climb. Roll-up doors held shut by basic locks. A parking lot with clear sight lines that provided no defensive advantage whatsoever. The facility had been designed to keep temperatures stable, not to repel human beings who would literally kill for a frozen pizza. "Call everyone on shift," I told Marcus. "Get them to the break room now. We have about 10 minutes to decide if we're staying or running. You've just read how my world changed in a single morning, how abundance became the most dangerous thing I could possess. If you've ever watched something you built become your biggest threat, you understand the calculation I'm about to make. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will redefine everything you think about survival." 7 of us gathered in the break room that smelled like burnt coffee and the industrial cleaner we used on the floors. Marcus stood by the door, checking the parking lot through the window every 30 seconds. The others sat at the table where we usually discussed delivery schedules and maintenance issues. Tommy Chen, our lead refrigeration technician who could diagnose a compressor problem by sound alone. Robert Hayes, the forklift operator who'd been with Glacier Point since it opened 12 years ago. Kevin Park and Daniel Smith, both warehouse workers in their 20s who treated loading trucks like a competitive sport. And James Wheeler, our night security guard who'd stayed past his shift when the highway started looking wrong. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. The infrastructure is collapsing. No power grid, no deliveries, no law enforcement coming if we call for help. We have two options: lock this place down and defend what we have, or load what we can carry and try to reach somewhere safer. I need everyone's vote, and I need it now. Safer where? Tommy asked, his arms crossed. Every city within 500 miles is reporting outbreaks. My sister's in Denver. She said the National Guard shot civilians who tried to breach their supply depot. Where exactly do you think is safer than a building full of food and thick walls? These aren't thick walls, Kevin said, gesturing at the corrugated metal that made up most of our structure. This place was built to keep cold air in, not zombies out. What happens when 1,000 people show up demanding food? We gonna fight them off with pallet jacks? Robert leaned back in his chair, the metal frame creaking under his weight. I got nowhere to go. My ex-wife took our kids to her sister's place in Montana last month before any of this started. This facility is the most valuable piece of real estate in the state right now. Food and power generation. If we abandon it, someone else takes it over within hours, and we become just another group of desperate people fighting for scraps. James, who'd been quiet until now, cleared his throat. I spent 8 years in the Army before this job. Logistics and supply chain management in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when food becomes scarce. People become animals, but organized animals who plan and coordinate. If we stay, we need to think like we're defending a forward operating base, not a warehouse. That means reinforced perimeters, rationing protocols, and accepting that we will have to turn away people who are starving. The room went silent. The hum of the refrigeration units filled the space, a reminder of the massive power draw required to keep our fortress of frozen food from spoiling. Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. My mom lives alone in Lincoln. I can't just leave her. I met his eyes across the table. If you go into the city, you probably won't come back. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because that's the reality we're looking at. But I won't stop anyone from leaving. This has to be a choice everyone makes with full information. Marcus pulled up a map on his laptop, connecting it to the TV mounted on the break room wall. Here's what we're working with. Glacier Point sits a mile outside the city limits, mostly surrounded by industrial parks and farmland. The nearest residential area is half a mile south. We have our own substation that connects directly to the main power line. 3 diesel generators rated for backup power, but they'll drain fuel fast if we lose grid electricity. We have maybe 800 gallons of diesel on site, enough to run the critical refrigeration units for 2, maybe 3 weeks if we're conservative. Then we die slowly instead of quickly, Kevin muttered. What's the point? The point is that fuel becomes our currency, I said. The plan forming as I spoke. We can't eat everything here before it spoils, but we can trade food for fuel, for security, for alliances with other survivor groups. This facility becomes a distribution hub instead of just a target. We set up rationing systems, establish trade routes with nearby farms and settlements, create something that resembles infrastructure instead of just hoarding until someone takes it by force. Tommy shook his head. You're talking about building a society in the middle of an apocalypse, while people are eating each other out there. "You want to survive longer than next month?" I shot back. "Pure defense fails eventually. We need to provide value to the people around us, make ourselves more useful alive than dead. That means controlled distribution, not isolated hoarding." The vote took less than 5 minutes. Daniel chose to leave, taking one of the company trucks and a week's worth of frozen food we packed for him. I watched him drive south toward Lincoln, knowing I'd probably never see him again. The rest of us stayed, and in that moment, Glacier Point Cold Storage Facility transformed from my job into my entire world. We had no illusions about the difficulty of what we'd chosen. We'd just made ourselves the most valuable target in a collapsed society. And every decision from this point forward would be measured in lives saved or lost. The first week was entirely about fortification and inventory. Tommy worked around the clock to optimize our power consumption, shutting down entire sections of the warehouse to consolidate the food into the most efficient refrigeration zones. We moved everything into warehouses A and B, leaving C and D as potential buffer zones if we needed to fall back during an attack. Robert and Kevin used forklifts to create barriers at the entrances, stacking loaded pallets into walls that would slow down any vehicle attempting to ram through. James took inventory of everything in the facility that could be weaponized. Nail guns from the maintenance shop, industrial chemicals that could be turned into deterrents. Even the forklifts themselves became potential defensive tools. Marcus and I focused on the power situation. Our facility drew enormous amounts of electricity to maintain temperatures ranging from 35 degrees in the refrigerated sections to -20 in the deep freeze units. The compressors alone required enough power to run a small neighborhood. When the grid went down on day 4, the sudden silence was terrifying. The constant hum of refrigeration had become such a part of the background that its absence felt like a held breath. We had exactly 6 hours before temperatures started rising above safe levels, before our fortress of food began its transformation into 400 tons of rotting biological waste. Tommy got the first generator online within 20 minutes, running the critical systems for the frozen meat storage. The diesel engine roared like a living thing, burning through fuel at a rate that made my chest tight with anxiety. I did the math while Marcus helped Tommy connect the second generator to the produce refrigeration units. 800 gallons of diesel. 3 generators consuming approximately 30 gallons per hour combined when running the essential systems. 26 hours of operation before we were out of fuel. Just over 1 day before everything we'd fought to protect became worthless. "We need to raid the gas stations," James said, studying a local map he'd found in the office. "There are 2 truck stops within 3 miles of here, both with underground tanks that should still have fuel. Possibly 10,000 gallons between them if they haven't been drained already." "That's a suicide run," Marcus argued. "Those places will be swarmed with infected or survivors who had the same idea. We can't risk losing people for fuel we're not even sure is there." I watched the fuel gauge on the generator slowly descend, each fraction representing minutes of preserved food, hours of survival. "We can't risk not going." "James, how many people do you need?" 3 total, including me. 1 driver, 1 lookout, 1 to operate the pump. Fast in, fast out. We go at dawn when visibility is good but most infected are less active." Robert volunteered immediately, his practical nature making him ideal for the high-stress extraction. Marcus reluctantly agreed to be the third, his mechanical knowledge potentially crucial if we encountered problems with the fuel pumps. I wanted to go myself, but James was right that someone needed to stay at Glacier Point to coordinate defenses if things went wrong. Tommy would remain to keep the generators running. Kevin would help me watch the perimeter and prepare for the possibility that our fuel team wouldn't return. They left at first light on day 5, taking our most reliable truck and every empty container we could find that would safely transport diesel. I watched from the roof of Warehouse A, using binoculars to track their progress down the access road, until they disappeared behind a line of industrial buildings. The highway in the distance continued to smolder in places, abandoned vehicles creating a monument to humanity's sudden collapse. Infected wandered through the maze of cars, their movements random until something triggered their attention. Then they moved with frightening purpose and speed. Kevin joined me on the roof, carrying 2 nail guns we'd modified to fire without needing to be pressed against a surface. Not exactly military-grade weapons, but better than fighting with our bare hands. "How long do you give them?" he asked. 2 hours there and back, plus time to pump the fuel. 4 hours total if everything goes perfectly. 6 hours if they encounter problems. After that, we're alone with 1 day of fuel and no way to get more. I didn't respond because he'd summarized our situation with brutal accuracy. We sat in silence, watching the sun climb higher, burning off the morning fog to reveal more of the devastation below. A group of infected emerged from the residential area to the south, maybe 20 of them moving in a loose pack. They followed the road for a while before dispersing, their attention captured by sounds or movements invisible to us at this distance. I tried to imagine living like that, stripped of reason and personality, reduced to base hunger and aggression. Some people were calling them zombies, but that word felt too fictional for the horror we were witnessing. These had been people days ago, neighbors and co-workers and someone's family members. The radio crackled with Marcus's voice 3 hours later. "Derek, we're 5 minutes out. We hit complications, but we got the fuel. Open the south gate and be ready to close it fast. We've got followers." Kevin and I scrambled down from the roof, sprinting to the south entrance where we'd created a makeshift gate from chain-link fence sections reinforced with metal posts. I could hear the truck's engine before I saw it, the sound growing louder as it approached. Then the vehicle burst around the corner, its bed loaded with yellow diesel containers and a plastic tank we normally used for equipment cleaning. Behind it, running with the tireless gait I'd come to recognize, came at least a dozen infected. They'd been normal people once, wore normal clothes, but their movements and the blood staining their mouths and hands marked them as something else now. The truck shot through the gate opening, and Kevin and I immediately began pushing the chain-link barrier closed. The nearest infected slammed into it 3 seconds later, the fence bowing inward from the impact. Hands reached through the gaps, grasping at air, and I saw James in the passenger seat, raising a fire extinguisher. He leaned out the window and blasted the closest infected with chemical foam, creating enough confusion for us to finish securing the gate. We'd reinforced it with metal posts sunk into concrete, and after a moment of testing the barrier's strength, the infected began moving along the perimeter fence instead, looking for another way in. Marcus climbed out of the driver's seat, his face pale and his hands shaking. Robert emerged from the back of the truck, blood on his sleeve but apparently uninjured. James was the last out, moving with the controlled calm of someone running on training and experience rather than emotion. "We got approximately 1,200 gallons, he reported. "First gas station was a loss, completely overrun. Second truck stop had some infected inside, but the underground tanks were intact. We had to fight our way out when more showed up, attracted by the noise of the pump. Robert got grabbed," Marcus added, his voice tight. "One of those things came out of the bathroom while we were filling containers. got hold of his arm, but James put it down before it could bite. I looked at Robert's bloody sleeve with new understanding. "Show me the wound." Robert rolled up his sleeve to reveal 4 parallel scratches where fingernails had raked his skin, drawing blood but not breaking deep. No bite marks, no tears that suggested teeth had made contact. "It didn't bite me," he said firmly. "Just scratched when I pulled away." "We don't know if that matters," Kevin said, backing away slightly. "What if scratches transmitted too? Robert, you bunk in the office section, separate from the rest of us. Any sign of fever, confusion, aggression, you tell us immediately. Everyone else, let's get this fuel transferred to the main tank before we lose more generator time." We spent the next hour moving diesel from containers to our storage tank, each gallon representing more hours of preserved food and continued survival. The infected at the fence gradually wandered away, their attention spans apparently limited once we stopped making noise. By nightfall, we had enough fuel to run the critical generators for approximately 2 weeks if we maintained current consumption levels. Tommy thought he could stretch it to 3 weeks by rotating which warehouse sections received power, essentially playing a complex game of temperature management to prevent spoilage while minimizing energy use. Robert showed no signs of infection over the next 48 hours, suggesting that scratches alone weren't enough to transmit whatever had turned humans into mindless predators. But the fuel run had demonstrated how quickly we'd burn through our resources and how dangerous acquisition would become. We needed a long-term solution that didn't involve constant suicide missions into increasingly hostile territory. "I know what you're thinking, that we should have run while we had the chance, that staying made us targets. But out there, everyone was a target with nothing to defend. We had 400 tons of food and a plan to make it last. If that sounds crazy, you're starting to understand the impossible math of survival. Comment what you would have done differently, because the next decision I make will haunt me forever." The first survivors appeared at our gate on day 9, and with them came the moral calculations that would define everything that followed. A man named Craig led a group of 6 people, all of them looking gaunt despite the outbreak being barely over a week old. They'd been holed up in a strip mall, surviving on vending machine snacks and whatever they could scavenge from abandoned stores. When those supplies ran out, someone remembered the cold storage facility on the industrial road, and they'd made the dangerous journey to find us. I met them at the gate with James beside me, both of us carrying improvised weapons. Craig did the talking, his voice hoarse from dehydration or shouting or both. "We know you have food in there. We can see the generators running, hear the compressors. We're not asking for charity. We can work, provide security, help with whatever you need. Just don't let us starve when you're sitting on enough food to feed an army." Behind him, I could see a woman cradling a child who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. That detail was deliberate, positioned where I couldn't help but notice. The rest of the group looked capable enough, tired and scared, but not yet desperate enough to be dangerous. Still, letting them in meant dividing our resources, expanding our group beyond people I'd personally vetted, and setting a precedent that we were accepting refugees. "How many people know about this facility?" I asked. Craig glanced at the others before responding. "Everyone in the area knows about it. You're the only major food storage within 50 miles. If we found you, others will too. That's why you need more people. 6 isn't enough to defend this place when hundreds of hungry survivors realize where the food is." He wasn't wrong. Our perimeter was still barely adequate, our defensive capabilities limited to a handful of improvised weapons and 6 people who were already exhausted from round-the-clock guard shifts. More people meant more security, more hands to improve fortifications, more diversity of skills. It also meant more mouths to feed, more complex social dynamics, and a higher chance of internal conflict or betrayal. James leaned close, speaking just loud enough for me to hear. We let them in. We can't let them leave. They'll know our exact situation, our weaknesses, where the fuel and food are stored. They become part of this, or they become a security risk we can't afford. I studied Craig's face, looking for deception or hidden agendas, but saw only the tired desperation of someone trying to keep his people alive. What skills do you bring? I was a contractor, supervised construction crews. I can help improve your defenses, make this place more secure. Beth over there was a nurse. Aaron worked in agriculture, knows about food safety and preservation. The others can labor, guard, whatever you need. A nurse would be invaluable when injuries inevitably occurred. Construction skills could transform our chain-link fence into something more substantial. Agricultural knowledge might help us extend our food supplies through rationing and preservation techniques. The benefits were real, but so were the risks. Here are the terms, I finally said. You work under our authority. No exceptions, no arguments. Food is rationed equally based on the physical demands of each person's assigned tasks. You share guard duty, construction duty, and any other responsibilities we assign. You don't leave without approval, and if you try to steal or sabotage, you're expelled permanently with nothing. Are those terms acceptable? Craig nodded immediately. We accept. Thank you. You're saving our lives. Don't thank me yet, I replied, unlocking the gate to let them through. Saving lives just means being responsible for them, and that's a burden I'm not sure any of us are ready for. We integrated the new arrivals over the following days, assigning them bunks in the office section and putting them to work on immediate needs. Craig proved as capable as advertised, designing improvements to our perimeter that transformed the chain-link fence into a more substantial barrier. We scavenged materials from nearby abandoned businesses, metal poles, concrete blocks, sheets of corrugated metal, anything that could be welded or bolted into a defensive wall. Beth established a medical station in one of the empty offices, inventorying the limited first aid supplies we had and making lists of medications we'd need to scavenge. Aaron's agricultural background led to an interesting discovery when he examined our inventory in detail. You're thinking about this all wrong, he told me while we stood in the frozen meat section, surrounded by pallets of beef and pork. You're worried about the fuel to keep the freezers running, but you should be thinking about converting this into preserved food that doesn't require refrigeration. Salt curing, smoking, dehydration. We could process this meat into forms that last months without power. The idea had merit but required equipment and materials we didn't have. Smokers, curing salts, dehydration racks. Where do we get that stuff? I used to buy equipment there for the farm operation I managed. If it hasn't been completely looted, we could find everything we need. I added it to the growing list of dangerous supply runs we'd need to make. Every trip outside our walls meant exposure to infected and hostile survivors, but staying isolated meant slowly burning through resources that couldn't be replaced. We were trapped in a constant calculation, risk lives now to extend survival later, or preserve our people at the cost of eventual starvation. The reality of our food situation became clearer as Tommy and I worked through the math. 13 people total now, each requiring approximately 2,000 calories per day to maintain health while performing physical labor. 26,000 calories daily across our entire group. 400 tons of food translated to roughly 3.2 million total calories, depending on the exact mix of meat, produce, and packaged goods. At current consumption, we had approximately 123 days before we exhausted our supplies completely, just over 4 months. But that calculation assumed perfect efficiency, no spoilage, no waste, no need to trade food for other essential supplies like medicine or fuel. In reality, we'd be lucky to stretch our stores for 3 months, and that was feeding just 13 people. If our population grew, the timeline shortened proportionally. The cold storage facility that had seemed like an infinite abundance was actually a ticking clock counting down to starvation. We need to start the preservation work immediately, I told Marcus during our nightly planning meeting. Convert as much of the meat as possible into cured and smoked forms. It'll be less appetizing than fresh frozen steaks, but it'll last without power consumption. That'll take weeks of work, he replied. We'd need to dedicate multiple people full-time to processing meat, which means fewer people on perimeter security and construction. Then we make hard choices about priorities. James, what's the minimum crew you need to maintain adequate security? James had been studying our facility's layout with the intensity of someone planning a military operation. 4 people on rotating shifts, 2 awake at any time covering different sections of the perimeter. That leaves 9 people for other tasks during the day. But Derek, we have a bigger problem than labor allocation. Our walls are improving, but they won't stop a determined assault by a large group. We're visible from the highway. Smoke from our generators announces our presence, and every day that passes means more survivors realize we have food while they're starving. We're not preparing for if we get attacked. We're preparing for when. His words hung in the air like a prophecy. I'd been so focused on immediate problems that I hadn't fully processed the inevitable trajectory we were on. Glacier Point wasn't just valuable. It was the most valuable location in the region. Eventually, someone would decide they wanted it badly enough to take it by force, and our reinforced fences and improvised weapons wouldn't be enough to stop them. Then we need allies, I said. Other survivor groups who benefit from our existence, who have a stake in protecting this facility because we provide them with food. We can't defend this place alone, but maybe we can create a network of communities who meet us alive. That's a huge gamble, Marcus countered. You're betting that people will honor agreements when they're starving. That they won't just take everything and kill us once they realize we're outnumbered. I'm betting that some people still think beyond tomorrow. That some communities are trying to build instead of just take. And I'm betting our long-term survival depends on being valuable to more people than we could ever fight off. Kevin had been quiet during the discussion, but he finally spoke up. My uncle runs a farm about 15 miles north of here. Big operation. Cattle and grain. If they survived, they'd have food production but no way to store or process it long-term. Might be worth making contact, seeing if we can establish a trade relationship. It was a starting point. Over the next week, we began cautiously reaching out to nearby areas, sending 2-person teams in our remaining vehicles to map survivor populations and assess potential trading partners. The picture that emerged was complex and often dark. Some groups had organized into functional communities, rationing their supplies and trying to maintain social order. Others had descended into violence and chaos, with the strong taking from the weak and no thought beyond immediate survival. And everywhere the infected roamed in growing numbers, drawn to noise and movement, turning the space between communities into dangerous territory that grew harder to traverse with each passing day. Kevin's uncle, a man named Russell who ran a 1,000-acre spread, became our first real trading partner. His farm had survived relatively intact, protected by distance from the initial outbreak, and by Russell's immediate decision to shoot anyone who approached without permission. He had cattle, grain, and the ability to produce food indefinitely if he could keep his operation running. What he didn't have was fuel for his equipment, medicine for his workers, or any way to preserve meat beyond immediate consumption. We established a weekly exchange. Russell would provide live cattle that we could process and freeze, extending our food supplies beyond our initial inventory. In return, we'd provide preserved meat from our stores, fuel siphoned from abandoned vehicles we'd scavenged, and access to Beth's medical knowledge when his people got injured or sick. It wasn't perfect, and both sides approached the arrangement with deep caution, but it represented something more valuable than any individual resource, the beginning of an economic system based on mutual benefit rather than pure violence. Other partnerships followed over the coming weeks. A community of engineers holed up in a water treatment plant needed food, but could provide clean water and eventually help us establish more sustainable power generation through solar or wind systems they could design and build. A group of former emergency responders controlling a hospital had medical supplies but limited food. A mechanic who'd fortified an auto shop could repair vehicles and manufacture simple weapons in exchange for regular meals. We weren't creating a society. We were creating a survival network where each node provided something essential that others lacked. Glacier Point sat at the center, the food distribution hub that made all other trade possible. I'd become what Aaron called the Food King, though the title felt more like a curse than an honor. Every distribution decision meant choosing who ate and who went hungry. Every trade negotiation involved calculating which resources we could spare against which we desperately needed. And every new community we connected with meant more people who knew exactly where 400 tons of food sat waiting to be taken. The first serious assault came on day 37, and it nearly broke us. They came at dusk when the light made visibility difficult, a calculated tactical choice that told me we were facing people with military or law enforcement training. James spotted them first, from his position on the Warehouse A roof, using binoculars to scan the perimeter during his regular sweep. 23 figures moving with coordinated precision through the industrial park to our east, using abandoned vehicles and buildings for cover as they approached. They wore mismatched tactical gear scavenged from sporting goods stores or police stations, carried actual firearms instead of improvised weapons, and moved like a unit that had trained together. "Contact east side," James called down through the open roof hatch. "Armed group at least 20. Combat formation. This isn't refugees looking for help. This is a raid." I'd been in the break room going over fuel consumption reports with Tommy when the alarm sounded. A simple but effective system we'd rigged using air horns mounted at intervals around the facility. The sharp blasts sent everyone scrambling to their assigned defensive positions. Marcus grabbed the hunting rifle we'd acquired from Russell's farm, taking position on Warehouse B's roof to provide covering fire if needed. Kevin and Robert moved to reinforce the east wall, carrying the nail guns and several Molotov cocktails we'd prepared from diesel and glass bottles. Craig positioned himself at the main gate with Aaron and 2 others from his original group, ready to repel any flanking maneuver. Beth stayed in the medical station with our most vulnerable member, Craig's nephew who'd broken his arm in a construction accident the previous week. If things went wrong, they'd barricade themselves in the freezer section and hope the attackers were more interested in food than hostages. It was a grim contingency plan that none of us wanted to test. I joined James on the roof, my heart hammering as I watched the attacking force complete their approach. They stopped just outside effective range of our defensive positions, taking cover behind a line of concrete barriers that some construction company had abandoned months ago. A single figure stepped forward, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. "My name is Colonel Mitchell," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the empty space. "Former National Guard, currently leading a community of 87 survivors in the Lincoln area. We know what you have in there. We know you're sitting on enough food to feed hundreds while people are starving in the streets. We're here to establish control of this facility and distribute its contents to the people who need it most. By force," I shouted back. "You're here to steal what we've worked to protect. I'm here to appropriate critical resources during a national emergency, which is well within military authority during a crisis of this magnitude. You can surrender peacefully and join our community as workers, or we can take the facility by force. Either way, the food gets distributed to people who need it," James whispered without moving his lips, his eyes still scanning the attacking force. "He's got us outnumbered 3-1. Better weapons and actual combat training. If they push this, we lose. Our walls will slow them down but won't stop a coordinated assault." I knew he was right. Our defenses had been designed to deter desperate individuals or small groups, not to repel a military-style operation led by someone who knew what he was doing. But surrendering meant losing control of Glacier Point, losing our position at the center of the trading network we'd built, and trusting that Mitchell's promises about fair distribution were genuine. History and human nature suggested that whoever controlled the food would take care of their own first, and we'd become expendable labor in someone else's hierarchy. "We've established a distribution system," I called back. "We're already trading with multiple communities, providing food in exchange for fuel, medical supplies, and other essential resources. You attack us, you destroy the only functioning supply chain in the region." Mitchell laughed, the sound harsh in the growing darkness. "You're playing merchant while people starve. That's not a distribution system. That's opportunistic profiteering. Last chance. Open the gates, or we come through them." I looked at James, at Marcus across the roof, at Kevin and Robert manning the east wall. Saw the fear in their eyes mixed with determination, the understanding that we'd built something worth fighting for, even if the odds were against us. Then I made a decision that would haunt me regardless of the outcome. "Tommy," I said into the radio clipped to my belt, "kill the generators. All of them. Right now. Derek, what? Do it. Shut everything down immediately." The constant hum of refrigeration that had become our facility's heartbeat simply stopped. The lights went out, plunging Glacier Point into darkness broken only by the dying light of sunset. I stood up, making myself visible to Mitchell's force, and shouted into the sudden quiet. "You see those compressors on the roof? You see this facility's infrastructure? It's specialized equipment that keeps 400 tons of food frozen and preserved. You damage it in an assault, you might take the facility, but the food will spoil within days. Every bullet that hits a refrigeration line, every fire that damages the compressor systems, every piece of collateral damage from your attack brings us closer to total loss. You'll win the battle and lose everything you came for." I let that sink in before continuing. "But here's what I'm offering. We keep operating as a neutral distribution hub. Your community of 87 gets regular food allocations, same as our other trading partners. You provide security for our supply runs in return. Help protect this facility from other raiders. You get fed without destroying the only source of preserved food in the region. Or you attack, risk destroying the infrastructure, and maybe win a warehouse full of rotting meat that'll be worthless in a week. The silence stretched out while Mitchell considered my words. I couldn't see his face clearly in the dimming light, but I could imagine the calculation happening behind his eyes. The strategic value of a functioning cold storage facility versus the immediate gain of seizure, the risk of infrastructure damage versus the certainty of acquiring food supplies, the long-term benefit of partnership versus the short-term satisfaction of conquest. How do I know you won't just shut us out once we back off? He finally called. You don't. Same way I don't know you won't come back with twice as many people and take this place by force once you've scouted our full defenses. We're both betting on mutual benefit outweighing betrayal. But I can tell you this, I've kept my agreements with every community we're trading with. Ask Russell at the Northern Farms. Ask the water treatment engineers. We deliver what we promise because our survival depends on being trustworthy. Then Mitchell gestured to his people, and they began withdrawing, moving back through the industrial park with the same coordinated precision they'd approached with. But before he disappeared into the darkness, Mitchell called out one more time. We'll take you up on that trade offer, but Derek, I'll be watching. If I find out you're hoarding while people starve, if I discover you're not honoring this deal, I'll come back with everything I have. And next time, I'll risk the infrastructure damage. I waited until they were completely gone before allowing myself to collapse against the roof's low wall, my legs suddenly weak with the adrenaline crash. James sat beside me, his hands shaking as he lowered his binoculars. That was the most insane bluff I've ever seen. What if he'd called it? What if he'd attacked anyway? Then we'd have fought and probably died, but at least we'd have gone down making them work for it. I replied. Tommy, bring the generators back online. Let's not actually spoil 400 tons of food just to prove a point. The compressors roared back to life, and with them came the familiar hum that meant safety and preservation and the continuation of everything we'd built. But the encounter with Mitchell's force had changed something fundamental. We were no longer a hidden fortress trying to survive unnoticed. We were a known strategic asset that every major group in the region would eventually have to negotiate with or conquer. Our survival now depended on maintaining that delicate balance, valuable enough that destroying us meant losing critical resources, but not so powerful that we became a threat that needed to be eliminated. We'd just survived our first military-style assault by betting everything on the value of what we protected. If you've ever had to bluff your way through impossible odds, you understand why my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Share this with someone who needs to hear about making hard choices with no good options. Mitchell's community became our largest trading partner over the following weeks, and the relationship remained tense but functional. They provided security escorts for our supply runs, which had become increasingly dangerous as infected populations grew and hostile survivor groups became more desperate. In return, we supplied his community with regular food allocations, calculated to provide basic nutrition without depleting our stores faster than our trading network could replenish them. The math of rationing became my constant obsession. I maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking every calorie that went out, every resource that came in, the population of each community we supported, and the projected timeline until our stores ran dry. Tommy had successfully converted approximately 40% of our frozen meat into cured and smoked forms that didn't require refrigeration, buying us crucial time and reducing our power consumption. Aaron's preservation work extended our supplies beyond the original calculations, but every new community that joined our network shortened the timeline again. By day 60, we were supporting 7 different communities with a combined population of approximately 300 people. Glacier Point had become exactly what I'd envisioned, a distribution hub at the center of an interconnected survival network. But with that position came responsibilities that weighed heavier with each passing day. Every morning I woke up knowing that my decisions about food allocation would determine who ate adequately and who went hungry. Every trade negotiation involved calculating which community needed resources most urgently, balanced against which could provide the most value in return. The psychological burden was crushing. I'd started having nightmares about the faces of people I'd had to turn away, communities that approached us asking for food but couldn't offer anything valuable enough in trade to justify depleting our stores. There was a settlement of elderly survivors in a retirement home 15 miles south who had nothing to trade except their desperation. A group of families with young children living in a fortified school who could offer labor but were too far away to participate in our supply network safely. I'd calculated that helping them would reduce our operational timeline by weeks, potentially endangering everyone already depending on Glacier Point. So I'd sent them away with minimal emergency rations and directions to other potential resources, knowing that most of them would probably die but unable to save everyone without dooming those I'd already committed to protecting. Marcus argued I'd made the right strategic choice. Craig said we'd lost our humanity when we started treating human lives as mathematical equations. I didn't know who was right, but I knew the weight of those decisions was changing me into someone I barely recognized. Beth noticed first, commenting during a routine medical check that I'd lost nearly 20 pounds despite having access to more food than 99% of survivors. Stress and guilt had killed my appetite, turned eating into a mechanical necessity I often forgot about until my body forced the issue. I was sleeping 4 hours a night, spending the rest of my time on guard duty or logistics planning or maintenance work. Anything to keep my mind occupied so I wouldn't think about the faces of people I'd turned away. "You're burning out," she said bluntly, checking my blood pressure with supplies we'd traded for from the hospital group. "You keep going like this, you'll collapse within a month. Then what happens to all these people depending on your leadership? Someone else takes over. Marcus or James or whoever's next most qualified. That's not how leadership succession works in a crisis, and you know it. When the person everyone looks to falls apart, the whole structure becomes unstable. You need to delegate more, trust other people to make decisions, and accept that you can't control every variable." I knew she was right, but delegation meant trusting others with decisions that could doom us all if made incorrectly. It meant accepting that someone else might calculate differently, might prioritize different communities, might make choices I wouldn't have made. But Beth's words stuck with me, and I began slowly shifting responsibilities to others in our core group. James took over all security operations and external negotiations with communities that wanted to join our network. His military background and tactical thinking made him better suited for assessing threats and establishing defensive protocols. Marcus assumed control of the day-to-day facility operations, managing power consumption and maintenance schedules. While I focused on strategic planning, Tommy continued his crucial work on refrigeration optimization and food preservation. Craig supervised construction and fortification projects that steadily improved our defensive capabilities. This distributed leadership model reduced my workload, but didn't eliminate the fundamental burden. I was still the person who made final decisions about food distribution, still the one who chose which communities got allocations and which got turned away. That responsibility couldn't be delegated without fracturing the trust and consistency that held our network together. The turning point came on day 83, when a community I'd refused to help showed up at our gates with their dead. Literally. They brought the bodies of 6 people who'd starved to death, loaded them in the back of a pickup truck, and demanded to know why we'd let them die while hoarding abundance behind our walls. Their leader, a woman named Sarah, who'd once been a social worker, stood at our gate with tears streaming down her face and rage making her voice shake. "You could have saved them," she shouted, pointing at the bodies. "We came to you 3 weeks ago asking for help. You gave us 2 days of food and sent us away. We tried to find other resources. We scavenged every abandoned store and house within 10 miles. We ate things I can't even describe. And they still died. Children. Derek. We lost children because you decided we weren't worth trading with." I wanted to explain the math, the calculations that showed helping her community would have reduced our stores by 15%, with no way to replenish them. I wanted to describe the 7 other communities depending on Glacier Point, the 300 people whose survival hinged on us maintaining adequate reserves. I wanted to justify my decision with logistics and strategy, and the cold equations that governed our new reality. But standing there looking at those bodies, seeing the accusation in Sarah's eyes, and the grief etched into every line of her face, all my justifications felt hollow. I'd made a choice that saved 300 lives by abandoning 40. The math was sound, but the morality was murky at best, monstrous at worst. "I'm sorry," I said. The words inadequate, but the only ones I had. "You're right. I could have helped, and I chose not to, because I calculated that other communities had more strategic value. I decided your people were worth less than maintaining my supply network. That choice kept 300 people alive but killed 6 of yours. I don't know if I made the right decision. I just know it's the decision I made." Sarah stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she picked up a piece of concrete rubble from the ground and hurled it at our gate, the impact ringing like a bell. "I hope your math was worth it. I hope when you're lying awake at night you remember their faces and feel proud of the strategic genius who let children starve for the greater good." She left with her people and their terrible cargo, and I stood at the gate long after they'd disappeared, feeling the weight of those deaths settle onto shoulders already burdened with impossible choices. Marcus found me there an hour later, still staring at the road where the truck had vanished. "You made the call you thought would save the most people," he said quietly. "That's all anyone can do in this situation. You can't save everyone, Derek. The world doesn't allow for that anymore." "Then what's the point?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "If we're just choosing who lives and who dies based on strategic value, how are we any different from the raiders and warlords? We're just better at justifying our cruelty with spreadsheets and logistics. The difference is that we're trying to build something instead of just taking. We're creating a system where more people survive than would if everyone acted purely from self-interest. It's not perfect. It's not even good, but it's better than the alternative. You have to believe that, or this all falls apart." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe that our efforts meant something beyond postponing inevitable collapse. But Sarah's accusation had cracked something in the mental framework I'd built to justify my decisions. I couldn't unsee those bodies, couldn't unhear her grief, couldn't calculate away the reality that my strategic choices had real human costs measured in corpses. The crisis of conscience might have broken me entirely if circumstances hadn't forced immediate action. 2 days after Sarah's visit, Russell's farm came under attack by a large raiding party, and we faced a decision that would define whether our network was a genuine alliance or just opportunistic trading between groups who'd abandon each other when threatened. Russell's panicked radio call came through while James and I were planning a supply run to a pharmaceutical depot. "We've got at least 30 hostiles trying to break through our perimeter. They've got trucks and weapons and they're coordinated. I don't think we can hold them off." If they take the farm, your food production pipeline dies with it. James met my eyes across the table, and I saw my own understanding reflected there. Russell's farm provided us with fresh meat and grain that extended our stores beyond our initial inventory. Losing him meant losing our only renewable food source, shortening our survival timeline by months. But helping him meant sending our people into an active combat situation against a superior force, risking lives to protect a strategic asset. The old Derek would have made the calculation, weighed the strategic value against the human cost, and sent help because the math supported it. But something had shifted after Sarah's visit, after confronting the reality that my decisions had faces and names and bodies loaded in pickup trucks. I found myself making the choice for different reasons this time. James, assemble everyone who can fight. We're going to help Russell, not because he's strategically valuable, but because he's our partner and we don't abandon our partners when they're in trouble. James grinned, the expression fierce and approving. Now that's a reason worth fighting for. Let's move. We mobilized 12 people within 20 minutes, loading into vehicles with every weapon we could carry. The rifles we'd traded for, the improvised weapons we'd manufactured, even some of Craig's Molotov cocktails and the nail guns that had become our signature defensive tool. Mitchell's community contributed 8 additional fighters when I radioed requesting assistance, honoring the security agreement we'd established. 20 armed people heading toward an active raid wasn't a military force, but it was enough to change the tactical balance. The drive to Russell's farm took 30 minutes across roads increasingly choked with abandoned vehicles and wandering infected. We arrived to find the raiding party had breached Russell's outer fence and were pushing toward the main house where he and his people had barricaded themselves. Gunfire echoed across the fields, punctuated by shouting and the crash of breaking wood. James assessed the situation with tactical precision, identifying the raiders' vehicles and supply position, then directed our force to flank from the east while Mitchell's fighters created a distraction from the south. What followed was 15 minutes of chaos that I remember more in sensations than coherent narrative. The deafening crack of rifles, the smell of diesel smoke from a burning truck, Kevin beside me reloading a nail gun with shaking hands, the sight of a raider going down from Marcus's shot, the crushing weight of fear and adrenaline, and desperate determination to protect what we'd built. The raiders broke when they realized they were caught between multiple forces, retreating in disorder and leaving several of their wounded behind. We'd taken casualties too. One of Mitchell's fighters with a gunshot wound to the leg, Robert with a knife slash across his arm, and Craig with a concussion from falling during the initial assault. But we'd held. We'd defended our partner and preserved the alliance that made our survival network functional. Russell emerged from his barricaded house looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him, his hand still gripping a shotgun and his eyes shell-shocked from the violence. "You came," he said simply, as if he hadn't quite believed we would. "You actually came." "We're partners," I replied. "That means something. You needed help. We helped. That's how this works if it's going to work at all." We'd just fought our first real battle, not for strategic advantage, but because we decided that alliances meant something beyond mathematical calculations. If you've ever had to choose between safety and honor, between calculation and commitment, you understand why this moment mattered more than any ration spreadsheet. Like this if you believe some things are worth fighting for even when the math doesn't support it. The defense of Russell's farm transformed our network from a loose collection of trading partners into something that resembled an actual alliance. Word spread through the survivor communities that Glacier Point and its partners would actively defend each other, that attacking one meant confronting all. It wasn't a perfect deterrent, But it changed the calculation for raiders and hostile groups considering whether to assault our locations. But it also marked us as a military threat in addition to a strategic resource. Larger survivor factions began paying more attention to our activities, assessing whether we represented a future challenge to their authority. Mitchell admitted during a supply exchange that several warlord-type leaders in the greater Lincoln area were discussing whether to coordinate an attack that would overwhelm our combined defenses. We'd reached a critical threshold, powerful enough to be taken seriously, not yet powerful enough to be truly secure. The solution came from an unexpected source. During one of our regular trading sessions with the water treatment engineers, their leader, a man named Victor who designed municipal water systems before the collapse, proposed a radical expansion of our network. "You're thinking too small," he said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the table in our break room. "Right now, you're defending individual locations against individual threats. But what if we created an integrated community spanning multiple sites? Glacier Point remains the food hub. My facility provides clean water. The hospital group handles medical care. We link them with regular supply convoys, establish shared defense protocols, and create something that looks more like a functioning society than scattered survival camps." "That's a massive coordination challenge," Marcus objected. "We're talking about dozens of people spread across 100 square miles trying to operate as a single community while physically separated. The logistics alone would be nightmare." "The logistics are already a nightmare," Victor countered. "Right now, Derek coordinates 7 separate trading relationships, each with its own negotiation and delivery schedule. James tries to organize security across multiple locations with no standardized protocols. We're constantly duplicating effort and operating inefficiently. Formal integration would be complex initially, but more stable long-term." I studied the map, seeing the potential in Victor's vision but also the tremendous risks. Creating an integrated community meant establishing formal governance structures, agreeing on shared rules and enforcement mechanisms, trusting partners to honor commitments when they could potentially benefit from betrayal. It required a level of social cohesion that seemed almost impossible in our current environment. But it also represented the only path forward I could see that didn't end in eventual collapse. Our current model was unsustainable. We were burning through our stored food supplies while trying to establish renewable production, defending multiple vulnerable locations with insufficient forces, and operating under constant threat from larger hostile factions. Integration would allow resource pooling, coordinated defense, and the beginnings of economic specialization that made complex societies function. "If we do this, we need buy-in from everyone," I said. "All 7 communities vote on whether to integrate, and the decision has to be unanimous. I won't force this on anyone, and I won't create a structure where some communities dominate others. Equal representation, or we don't do it at all." Over the next 2 weeks, we conducted what amounted to a referendum across our entire network. James and I visited each community, presenting Victor's proposal and addressing concerns about autonomy, resource distribution, and governance. Some groups embraced the idea immediately, seeing integration as the best path to long-term survival. Others resisted, afraid of losing independence or being outvoted by larger communities on critical decisions. The debate that mattered most happened at Mitchell's community. As our largest partner and the most militarily capable, his support or opposition would likely determine whether integration succeeded. I met with him in the community center they'd established, in a fortified elementary school, surrounded by his leadership council. "Here's my concern," Mitchell said after I'd finished my presentation. "You're proposing democratic governance across equal communities. But we both know that's not how power actually works. Glacier Point controls the food, which means you control everything. You can threaten to withhold supplies if we don't vote your way, can leverage the most essential resource to dominate decision-making. Why should we agree to a system that pretends to be equal but isn't? It was the fundamental question I'd been wrestling with since Victor first proposed integration. I did control the food, which meant I controlled the leverage that made our network function. Any formal governance structure had to address that imbalance, or it would collapse under the weight of resentment and distrust. You're absolutely right, I acknowledged. As long as Glacier Point monopolizes food storage and distribution, true equality is impossible. So here's what I'm proposing. We create shared food reserves across multiple locations. I'll transfer 20% of our current stores to facilities controlled by other communities, enough that no single location can dominate through resource control. We maintain Glacier Point as the primary distribution hub, because the infrastructure is already here, but we break the monopoly that makes democratic governance a sham. Mitchell leaned back, studying me with narrowed eyes. You'd voluntarily give up your primary source of leverage to make this work? I'd trade monopoly control for genuine partnership, yes, because I think our long-term survival depends on building something real instead of just maintaining my position at the top of a fragile hierarchy. And because I'm tired of being the person who decides who eats based on strategic calculations. I want to share that burden with a community that makes decisions collectively instead of one exhausted manager trying to play God with spreadsheets. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, Mitchell extended his hand. If you're serious about transferring those reserves, if you're willing to put this proposal in writing with enforcement mechanisms, then you have my community's support. Let's build something worth surviving for. The integration process took another month to implement fully. We established a council with representatives from each community, created shared defense protocols coordinated by James, and set up regular supply convoys that moved resources between locations. I transferred food reserves as promised, distributing our stores across multiple facilities to prevent any single point of control. The transition was messy and complicated, and required constant negotiation to address problems I hadn't anticipated. But slowly, something remarkable emerged. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were rebuilding. Victor's water treatment plant provided clean water to all integrated communities. The hospital group established medical clinics at each location. Russell's farm expanded production with labor provided by multiple communities. Craig's construction expertise improved defenses across the network. We started thinking in terms of seasons and years instead of days and weeks, planning for sustainable survival instead of just postponing collapse. By day 150, our integrated community supported over 400 people across 11 locations. We'd established functional governance, economic specialization, and defensive capabilities that deterred all but the largest hostile factions. Glacier Point had transformed from my burden into our shared asset, managed collectively instead of controlled by my increasingly questionable judgment. I'd lost my monopoly on power but gained something more valuable, partners who shared the weight of impossible decisions, a community that made choices collectively instead of relying on my calculations, and the possibility of rebuilding something that resembled civilization instead of just a particularly well-organized survival camp. The nightmares didn't stop completely. I still saw Sarah's face, still remembered the bodies in that pickup truck, still carried the weight of every person I'd turned away during those desperate early months. But now, when I woke from those dreams, I could look at what we'd built and see evidence that the sacrifices hadn't been meaningless, that we'd created something beyond just postponing inevitable collapse. 8 months after the outbreak, I stood on the roof of Warehouse A watching the sun rise over our network of communities. Smoke from Russell's farm rose in the distance, marking another day of food production. Convoys moved along the roads we'd cleared, carrying supplies between locations. Guard towers dotted the perimeter, manned by people from multiple communities working together. The constant hum of refrigeration continued below me, preserving food that now belonged to everyone, instead of just those lucky enough to be inside my walls when civilization fell. Marcus joined me on the roof, carrying 2 cups of coffee we'd acquired through trade with a community that had found an abandoned coffee warehouse. "Thinking about everything we've been through?" he asked. "Thinking about how we almost didn't make it, how many times we were one bad decision away from collapse. But we didn't collapse. We adapted, built alliances, and created something worth protecting. That counts for something." I took the coffee, letting its warmth seep into my hands. I spent months trying to control everything, calculating every decision, treating survival like a math problem I could solve with the right spreadsheet. Took me way too long to realize that what we needed wasn't better calculations. It was trust, partnership, willingness to share both resources and responsibility. "Took all of us too long to figure that out," Marcus replied. "We're all learning how to be human again in a world that tried to make us into animals. The fact that we're succeeding at all is remarkable." I could see people starting their day, farmers heading to Russell's transport for the daily commute, medical staff preparing for clinic rounds, children who'd survived the outbreak playing in the secured areas we'd established. Not paradise, not even comfort, but life continuing despite everything that had tried to destroy it. We made it 8 months in a world that tried to starve us, not because I had all the answers, but because we learned to carry the burden together. This is the end of my story from that cold storage warehouse, but it's just the beginning of whatever comes next. If this journey meant something to you, if you see yourself in these impossible choices, share this story. And subscribe, because survival isn't about one person's decisions. It's about communities choosing to build instead of just take. Thanks for walking this path with me. The outbreak that destroyed civilization had made me the temporary king of an abundance I never asked for, had forced me into calculations that measured human worth in strategic value and calories. But somewhere between those desperate early decisions and the community we'd built, I'd learned that survival wasn't about hoarding resources behind walls. It was about sharing the burden, trusting partners, and building systems where more people survived than would if everyone acted from pure self-interest. Glacier Point still stands, its refrigeration units humming, its warehouses full of food that belongs to everyone instead of just those inside my walls. I'm no longer the person who decides who eats, just one voice among many in a community making decisions collectively. The weight is lighter now, shared across hundreds of shoulders instead of crushing mine alone. Some nights, I still dream about Sarah's grief, about bodies in pickup trucks, about faces I turned away during those impossible early months. I don't think those nightmares will ever completely fade. But when I wake, I can see the communities we've built, the children who survived, the possibility that humanity might rebuild something worth calling civilization. That has to be enough, because it's all any of us have. The chance to build something better from the ruins of what we lost, one difficult decision at a time.